Seat 12F, identify yourself, the pilot said. The call sign turned the plane silent. People were rushing past, carrying rolling suitcases, backpacks, and briefcases, each lost in their own thoughts and plans. The sound of announcements over the public address system blended with the chatter of travelers, the clattering of luggage wheels, and the occasional laughter of children running ahead of their parents. Among the crowd, a man named James Porter moved with calm, purposeful steps. He didn't rush or push past anyone. Instead, he walked with the confidence of someone who had traveled these spaces countless times before. James was in his mid-40s, with neatly combed hair, sharp eyes that seemed to observe everything around him, and a face that carried the calmness of someone used to staying composed under pressure. He was dressed in a simple navy suit, a crisp white shirt beneath, and polished shoes. On his shoulder hung a worn leather laptop bag, its corners slightly frayed from years of use. In his hand, he carried a small, black briefcase, perfectly balanced as if it contained something fragile. To the casual observer, James looked like an ordinary businessman heading out on a routine trip. But there was something about the way he scanned the surroundings, the subtle way he measured his steps, that suggested there was more to him than met the eye. As he approached the check-in counter, James's eyes briefly flicked to the large digital display overhead. Flight 742 to New York was listed as on time, and the gate number was flashing in bright letters. He placed his briefcase on the counter and handed his passport to the attendant. She smiled politely, typing quickly into the computer before handing him his boarding pass. "Gate B14, she said with a polite nod. James thanked her with a quiet thank you and moved toward security. The security line was long, filled with people who were anxious to get through quickly. James slipped his boarding pass into the scanner and walked calmly through the metal detector, his demeanor serene. The scanner beeped lightly, and a security officer waved him through without further inspection. While other passengers sighed or fussed with their belongings, James moved as if he had all the time in the world, although every movement was precise, calculated, and efficient. Once through security, he made his way toward the gate area. The airport terminal was starting to fill with passengers waiting for their flights. Some sat quietly reading books or checking their phones, others engaged in soft conversations, and a few children ran back and forth between seats, their laughter echoing off the walls. James found a small bench near the gate and sat down, placing his briefcase carefully at his side. He took out his phone, scrolling through messages and emails, though his expression remained unreadable. Occasionally, he glanced up at the boarding gate, his eyes sharp and attentive, as if he were observing more than just the routine boarding announcements. Passengers began lining up when the boarding call was announced. Families with children, business travelers, elderly couples, and solo adventurers all moved forward in a slow, organized shuffle. James waited patiently, letting others go ahead. When it was finally his turn, he handed the boarding pass to the gate attendant, who scanned it and smiled politely. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said. James nodded quietly and stepped onto the jet bridge, walking steadily toward the aircraft. Inside the cabin, the smell of fresh cleaning chemicals mixed with the faint aroma of coffee brewing in the galley. Flight attendants moved efficiently down the aisle, checking for passengers and helping them find their seats. The hum of conversation filled the cabin as people settled in, stowing their carry-on bags in the overhead compartments or under the seats in front of them. James found his seat, 12F, by the window and placed his briefcase securely at his feet. He fastened his seatbelt, sat back, and looked out the window at the tarmac below. Planes were taxiing, engines roaring softly, and the sunlight reflected off their polished surfaces, creating a glimmering pattern across the concrete. As the passengers settled, James noticed a few details that most people would overlook. He observed a young man sitting a few rows ahead nervously tapping on his phone. A mother tried to calm her fussy toddler, offering toys and snacks. Across the aisle, an older couple whispered quietly to each other, occasionally looking out the window at the planes below. James's gaze was calm, but his mind was alert, processing every movement, every sound, every subtle shift in the environment. There was a rhythm to life inside the cabin, a rhythm he recognized and appreciated. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration. James watched politely, his eyes occasionally flicking to the other passengers. Some were distracted by their phones, Others were watching the flight attendants with polite attention. As the demonstration concluded, the plane prepared for takeoff. Engines roared louder, vibrations shook the floor slightly, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. James leaned back in his seat, hands resting calmly on his lap. His eyes remained focused on the horizon outside, though he appeared relaxed, almost casual. As the plane ascended into the sky, the hum of conversation gradually decreased. Passengers began adjusting their seats, opening books, or quietly chatting. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. James declined politely, keeping his attention on his surroundings. He noticed the small gestures of the crew. A hand on a shoulder here, a subtle nod there, actions that showed professionalism and care. Even small things mattered to him, and he absorbed these details with quiet observation. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have reached our cruising altitude. You may relax and enjoy the flight." Passengers leaned back, some closing their eyes, others continuing with books, phones, or conversations. James, however, remained alert, scanning the cabin subtly, observing the behavior of those around him without drawing attention. It was then that a soft alert sounded quietly from his briefcase. James glanced at it, his expression unchanged. He tapped a few buttons and the alert was dismissed. There was nothing to be concerned about, but his instincts told him to remain vigilant. He knew from experience that calm moments were often the ones that required the greatest attention. From the perspective of other passengers, James was just another traveler. They saw a man quietly reading, occasionally glancing out the window, nothing extraordinary in his demeanor. But for James, every glance, every sound, every subtle movement in the cabin was a piece of information, a puzzle to be understood. His past experiences had taught him to notice what others ignored, to be aware of the unseen currents that flowed beneath ordinary life. Time passed steadily as the plane flew across the clear blue sky. James occasionally closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to focus his mind to process information internally. He thought about the journey ahead, the tasks that awaited him once he landed, and the careful balance he had to maintain between his public persona and his true capabilities. He was used to being in spaces where secrecy and composure were essential, and even on a commercial flight, those habits persisted. Other passengers began to notice minor details about the man in 12F. A young woman sitting nearby thought she saw a faint insignia on his bag, though she wasn't sure. An elderly man glanced at James, calm demeanor, and wondered if he was someone important, perhaps a high-ranking business executive or a government official. But nobody knew the truth. To all appearances, James Porter was just an ordinary man on an ordinary flight, blending into the crowd while quietly maintaining a state of readiness that few could imagine. As the flight continued, small things caught James's attention. The subtle changes in cabin pressure, the patterns of conversation among passengers, the quiet signals exchanged between the flight crew. He remained seated, hands resting on his briefcase, eyes attentive but calm. Every detail mattered, and he absorbed them without alarm or haste. Passengers around him continued their routines, unaware of the tension beneath the calm. Some dozed, some worked on laptops, others chatted softly. But James' presence was like a quiet anchor in the midst of ordinary activity, someone whose awareness stretched beyond the obvious. He was ready for anything, though there was no immediate threat. The ordinary flight was a stage, and he was both participant and observer, moving through it with silent precision. By the time the plane had been in the air for over an hour, the passengers were settled into the rhythm of the journey. Meals had been served, drinks offered, and conversations were steady but polite. James remained focused, scanning subtly, always aware. He adjusted his position slightly, keeping comfortable but ready. He reflected quietly on the importance of vigilance, how ordinary situations often hid extraordinary events, and how training and awareness could make the difference in critical moments. As the first part of the flight drew on, the plane moved steadily above the clouds. The sunlight reflected off the wing and the engine, creating a bright, almost blinding glow in the window. James leaned slightly forward, observing the horizon, thinking about the miles that lay between him and his destination. He considered the people around him, their ordinary lives continuing in parallel with his own extraordinary awareness. For them, this was just a flight, a simple journey. For James, it was another chapter in a life defined by quiet preparation, attention to detail, and calm action in the midst of the ordinary. And so the flight continued. Passengers settled into the comfort of the cabin, unaware that among them sat a man whose past experiences and current capabilities set him apart from everyone else. Seat 12F seemed ordinary, but the presence of James Porter hinted at something extraordinary just beneath the surface, a calm before events that would soon reveal a reality far beyond the expectations of anyone aboard. The flight continued smoothly for several hours. Passengers had settled into their routines. Some read quietly, others worked on laptops or tablets, and a few dozed, the gentle hum of the engines lulling them into calm rest. The sunlight streaming through the windows painted soft patterns across the seats, reflecting off polished shoes, glimmering off small jewelry, and creating tiny golden spots on the cabin floor. The cabin was peaceful, almost ordinary. Almost. James Porter sat in seat 12F, observing everything. His calm posture gave no hint of the attention he paid to his surroundings. He watched the subtle interactions between passengers, noticed the small gestures of the flight attendants, and even felt the vibrations through the floor as the plane adjusted slightly in the sky. Everything was routine, yet James's instincts told him to remain vigilant. He had learned long ago that ordinary moments often carried extraordinary significance. Suddenly, the calm was broken by a voice over the intercom. It was firm, clear, and commanded immediate attention. "Seat 12F, identify yourself." The cabin went silent. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A mother holding a toddler paused, unsure of what to do. A businessman 2 rows ahead froze, pen suspended over his notepad. Even the soft clinking of drink carts seemed to disappear. Passengers glanced around, eyes wide, trying to understand what had just been said. Some whispered to each other, exchanging confused looks. The young woman sitting across the aisle from James leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowed. James did not flinch. His calmness remained, his face a mask of quiet composure. But inside, his mind worked rapidly. He had anticipated that something might happen, though he had not expected it to occur mid-flight. He understood immediately what the announcement implied. Someone somewhere had recognized the significance of his presence, and the pilots were now seeking confirmation. The flight attendants paused in their duties, their expressions carefully neutral but alert. They knew this was not a routine request. The murmurs among passengers grew slightly, but most were too polite or too cautious to ask what was happening. The tension in the cabin was tangible. Eyes shifted towards seat 12F, curiosity blending with unease. Who was this man, and why had the pilot asked him to identify himself? James took a slow, deliberate breath. He reached into his briefcase with one hand, producing a small, encrypted communication device he used for secure messages. The device had been used during his previous missions, now repurposed for moments like this when absolute discretion was necessary. With precise movements, he tapped a few buttons, confirming his identity through secure channels. A brief, nearly imperceptible nod from the captain over the intercom indicated acknowledgement. The passengers remained silent, waiting, sensing that something extraordinary had just happened. Some tried to return to their activities, but it was impossible. The energy in the cabin had shifted. Ordinary travelers now felt that they were witnessing an unusual event, though they did not know why. James's eyes, however, remained steady. He observed the reactions of those around him without appearing intrusive. A young man across the aisle was nervously fidgeting with his phone, clearly trying to record or capture the moment. James knew that such reactions were natural. People were drawn to unexpected events. Yet he also understood the importance of discretion. Nothing about his actions or identity should draw attention. Even in moments of recognition, calmness was the greatest ally. Captain Morales's voice returned, steady and professional, though now carrying an undertone of controlled attention. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. You may remain seated. Flight will continue as planned." The clarity of the announcement allowed the tension to ease slightly, but the cabin was still charged with curiosity. Passengers exchanged glances, wondering who Mr. Porter was and why his identification had caused such a reaction. James settled back into his seat, hands resting on his briefcase. From the outside, he appeared composed and ordinary, but inside, he reviewed the events carefully. He considered every possibility. Why had the recognition occurred now? How had the pilot received the information? Was there a risk involved, or was this a routine acknowledgement for someone of his profile? His mind cataloged the details, storing them for careful analysis later. Passengers nearby could not help but notice subtle signs that James was not an ordinary traveler. The faint insignia on his briefcase, the deliberate and precise way he had confirmed his identity, and the calm authority in his posture, all hinted at experience beyond what most people had seen. Some whispered quietly to each other, forming their own theories. Was he a government official, a military hero, or someone involved in intelligence work? The possibilities fascinated them, though none dared to ask aloud. The flight attendants continued their duties, but with heightened awareness. They moved down the aisles quietly, ensuring comfort while remaining observant. Every glance, every subtle gesture was part of a larger picture they were now carefully watching. Even the pilots seemed more attentive than usual, their communication with air traffic control smooth and professional, but tinged with the awareness that the cabin had shifted from ordinary to something remarkable. James reflected briefly on his past missions. He had been trained for situations where silence was paramount, where ordinary appearances could conceal extraordinary roles. Recognition, like what had just occurred, could be both an advantage and a risk. He knew how to manage it. Maintaining calm while assessing the environment was crucial. Every reaction, both his own and those of others, needed careful attention. Meanwhile, passengers continued to speculate quietly. The young woman a few rows ahead whispered to her companion, "Did you hear that?" "Seat 12F, identify yourself. That doesn't sound normal." Her companion nodded, eyes wide. "Yeah, it must be someone important, maybe some kind of government person." They did not realize how close their guess was to reality. James, listening subtly to snippets of conversation, allowed a faint, polite smile to cross his face. He appreciated curiosity. It was human, natural. But he knew that revealing more than necessary could create unnecessary complications. Some passengers leaned back in their seats, pretending to return to their activities, but their attention inevitably drifted back to 12F. Time seemed to stretch. The plane cruised steadily above the clouds, engines humming with a gentle, constant rhythm. The sunlight had shifted slightly, creating long shadows across the cabin floor. Passengers' anxiety had eased just enough to allow them to continue their reading, typing, or light conversation, but the underlying curiosity remained. The energy in the cabin had changed. Ordinary routines were now layered with intrigue. James remained seated, composed, but alert. His mind worked through various scenarios, upcoming meetings, potential challenges on the ground, and even the possibility that this recognition could trigger further attention once the plane landed. He reflected on how ordinary appearances could mask extraordinary truth. To most, he was just another traveler on a routine flight, yet his life experiences set him apart in ways invisible to the casual observer. The cabin slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The pilot's earlier announcement had been absorbed, yet its impact lingered subtly. Conversations picked up once again, but with a careful tone, as passengers continued to cast subtle glances toward James. Flight attendants moved efficiently, distributing water and snacks, while maintaining professional vigilance. Every interaction in the cabin now carried extra weight, a subtle acknowledgement of the unusual moment that had occurred. James reached into his briefcase again, this time producing a small notebook. He began to jot down notes in an almost imperceptible manner, tracking observations, environmental details, and potential implications of the events. Writing allowed him to maintain focus and mental clarity, a habit formed over years of disciplined training. He noted minor but important details, how passengers reacted, subtle signals from the crew, and even slight changes in air pressure that could indicate adjustments in altitude or speed. Each observation, though mundane to a casual observer, was part of a larger awareness that James maintained constantly. Passengers, meanwhile, continued their quiet speculation. Some had decided James was likely part of a high-level intelligence operation. Others thought he might be a decorated military officer traveling under low-profile circumstances. Children nearby were curious, but easily distracted by screens or toys. Adults, however, could not shake the unusual aura surrounding Seat 12F. Every gesture, every movement of James' calm posture was scrutinized in silent fascination. As the flight passed the midpoint, James allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the delicate balance between ordinary life and the extraordinary responsibilities he had carried in the past. Even now, he maintained vigilance, aware that ordinary people often missed the subtle signals that could make a critical difference in unexpected situations. Maintaining calm, appearing ordinary, and observing without distraction were skills honed over decades. Suddenly, a minor turbulence shook the plane slightly. Passengers instinctively grabbed armrests, some letting out quiet gasps. James remained seated, hands resting lightly on his briefcase, eyes steady. The flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, checking each passenger and ensuring safety. James noted the reactions around him, the subtle variations in tension, the human response to unexpected motion. These were small details, but they revealed a great deal about the environment, something he had learned to read with precision. As the turbulence passed, calm returned to the cabin. Conversations slowly resumed, and the hum of the engines filled the space once again. James continued to observe, reflecting on how ordinary situations could shift subtly into moments of significance. The earlier announcement by the pilot had introduced an unexpected tension, and though it had been managed with professionalism and discretion, its effects lingered. By the time the flight approached the final hour, James' awareness of the cabin remained acute. He noticed passengers stretching, adjusting their seats, and preparing for the descent ahead. Flight attendants moved efficiently, double-checking seat belts and preparing the galley for landing. James observed everything, not out of paranoia, but because years of experience had taught him the value of constant observation. Ordinary environments often contained extraordinary details for those trained to see them. And through it all, Seat 12F remained calm, ordinary in appearance, yet extraordinary in presence. James Porter's composure, observation, and quiet authority set him apart from the rest of the passengers, even as the flight continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. The cabin remained engaged in the subtle drama that had unfolded, unaware that they were witnessing a rare glimpse into a life defined by vigilance, discipline, and quiet heroism. The flight continued at cruising altitude, the plane cutting smoothly through the blue sky above a blanket of soft white clouds. Passengers had returned to their routines after the pilot's unusual announcement, but a subtle tension lingered in the cabin. Conversations were quieter than before, glances toward Seat 12F more frequent. There was something about James Porter that drew attention, though no one could quite put their finger on why. James sat calmly, hands resting lightly on his briefcase, his posture relaxed yet alert. From the outside, he looked like an ordinary traveler, but internally, his mind was active and precise. Every movement, every sound, every subtle change in the environment was registered, cataloged, and processed. He understood that the quiet in the cabin was not just curiosity. It was recognition, instinctively felt by those around him even without knowing the reason. The young woman across the aisle from James, a student on her way home from a study abroad program, couldn't help but glance at him again. She noticed the small insignia on his bag more clearly now, though she didn't recognize it. She whispered to her friend, "Do you think he's in the military or something? There's just something about him." Her friend nodded slowly, eyes still on James, sensing the same quiet authority he radiated. James, aware of the attention but not distracted by it, adjusted his position slightly and leaned back. He reflected on the hours of training, preparation, and discipline that had brought him to this point. His life had always been a balancing act between ordinary appearances and extraordinary responsibilities. He had learned to remain calm in high-pressure situations, to assess risks silently, and to act decisively when necessary. Even here on a commercial flight, those skills remained sharp and relevant. From the pilot's perspective, everything seemed routine, though the knowledge of James's presence added an extra layer of focus. Captain Morales had made the announcement not out of alarm, but out of procedure. Certain passengers, those who carried special security clearances or sensitive identities, required verification during flight for both safety and protocol reasons. James Porter was not a passenger that could be treated as ordinary, and the moment the call sign was recognized, the flight crew's attention subtly shifted. Meanwhile, passengers continued their quiet speculation. Some imagined that James was a retired military officer or a government agent traveling discreetly. Others simply thought he was an unusually composed traveler. Children nearby, unaware of the nuances, played quietly with their devices, but the adults couldn't help but watch the man in seat 12F with interest. His calmness stood in stark contrast to their curiosity, almost magnetic in its effect. James allowed himself a brief, internal smile. He understood the natural human tendency to notice subtle differences, especially in situations that deviated from the ordinary. His own life had been shaped by noticing details that others overlooked. Small gestures, changes in tone, fleeting expressions, all of these had been crucial in past missions. Now, even in the calm cabin of a commercial plane, these instincts guided him. A slight turbulence shook the plane gently, causing a ripple of movement through the cabin. Passengers instinctively gripped their armrests, some letting out quiet gasps. Flight attendants moved down the aisles with practiced efficiency, checking on everyone. James barely moved, his calm demeanor unaffected. To him, turbulence was a normal part of flight, nothing more. Yet he noted the reactions around him, understanding the subtle dynamics of human behavior in response to minor stress. A passenger a few rows ahead, an elderly man in a gray suit, whispered to his companion, "I've never seen anyone so calm during turbulence." "Look at him, it's like he's done this 100 times before." The companion nodded, eyes still fixed on James. In that moment, the ordinary cabin became a stage for subtle observation and admiration. James's attention, however, was not on admiration but on situational awareness. He scanned the cabin systematically, observing patterns in behavior, noting the positions of crew members, and mentally mapping every detail. Even mundane things, like the way a flight attendant adjusted her uniform or how a passenger held a book, contributed to the larger picture of awareness he maintained. As the hours passed, James reflected quietly on his past. Memories of training exercises, missions requiring precision and secrecy, and countless hours of preparation surfaced briefly in his mind. He had spent years operating in environments where calmness under pressure was not just desirable but necessary for survival. That training had become second nature, a part of who he was. Even here on a commercial flight, those skills were active, though invisible to everyone else. The pilot's earlier announcement had set the tone for the rest of the flight. Passengers were now subtly aware that something unusual had occurred, even if they did not fully understand it. Their curiosity was restrained, tempered by the professionalism and calm of the crew and by the quiet composure of James. He remained a figure of intrigue, quiet but undeniably significant. At one point, a flight attendant approached James with a polite, professional smile. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked softly. James nodded calmly. "Yes, thank you, all is well," he replied. His tone was even, measured, and reassuring. The flight attendant gave a small nod and moved on, her movements careful and attentive. She, like others in the cabin, sensed that James was not an ordinary passenger. James returned his attention to his surroundings. The hum of conversation resumed in the cabin, but it was subdued. People whispered to each other, some speculating quietly, others trying to maintain focus on their own activities. The ordinary flow of flight had resumed, yet the presence of James Porter added an undercurrent of tension and curiosity. He thought briefly about the impact of his presence on others. People naturally responded to confidence and calm. In moments of uncertainty, they looked for cues, subtle signals that indicated safety or threat. James's demeanor provided reassurance without words, a quiet anchor in the midst of ordinary uncertainty. He had spent years understanding human behavior in high-stress situations, and now, even among passengers on a routine flight, those skills were at work. The plane continued its steady course, sunlight shifting across the cabin, casting moving shadows on the rows of seats. Passengers adjusted, stretched, and prepared for the remainder of the journey. James remained attentive, aware that ordinary moments could shift unexpectedly. He thought of the miles ahead, the landing procedures, and the need to remain discreet while maintaining readiness. A young boy near the back of the cabin looked toward James, curiosity shining in his eyes. He tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is that man so calm, even when the plane shakes?" She smiled softly, not wanting to alarm her child. "Some people just stay calm, honey," she said gently. Yet the boy's interest remained, noticing something unusual in the man's posture, demeanor, and quiet presence. James observed without reacting, understanding the natural curiosity of those around him. Children, adults, and crew members alike sensed that he was not ordinary, though they did not know why. His calmness, his awareness, and his controlled presence created a subtle influence on the environment, shaping the perception of those around him without a single word spoken. Time continued to pass, the plane slicing through clouds at cruising altitude. James allowed himself a brief mental review of the cabin. He noted minor adjustments in passenger behavior, observed crew efficiency, and subtly analyzed patterns that could be relevant in unforeseen circumstances. Each observation was catalogued, adding to a mental map of situational awareness he had honed over decades. As the flight approached the later stages of cruising, James reflected quietly on his unique position. Ordinary travelers rarely understood the value of vigilance, of constant observation, and of calm composure. They moved through life focused on immediate tasks and minor details, often missing the broader context. James, however, had trained to notice the unseen, to anticipate outcomes, and to act decisively when required. Even a commercial flight could present moments that demanded attention, and he remained fully prepared. The cabin gradually relaxed further, though subtle glances toward seat 12F continued. Passengers speculated silently about who James was, crafting stories in their minds based on glimpses, gestures, and the aura of calm that surrounded him. Some imagined espionage, some military service, and others simply assumed he was a highly important figure traveling discreetly. James allowed a small, imperceptible smile to cross his face. He understood curiosity, human nature, and the importance of perception. Yet he remained focused, composed, and alert. His mind moved fluidly between observation, analysis, and preparation. Every passenger, every detail, every subtle change in the environment was registered, though none could perceive the full extent of his awareness. As the hours passed and the flight continued smoothly, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Conversations resumed, electronic devices were used, and the gentle hum of the engines provided a steady background. Yet the earlier moment, the announcement by the pilot and the recognition of James Porter, remained an unspoken anchor, a subtle reminder that ordinary appearances often concealed extraordinary truths. And through it all, seat 12F remained calm, ordinary to the casual observer, yet extraordinary in presence. James Porter sat quietly, aware of the environment, prepared for any eventuality, and quietly commanding attention without a single overt gesture. Passengers, crew members, and even the plane itself seemed to acknowledge the subtle shift in energy, an invisible recognition of someone whose life had been defined by vigilance, discipline, and quiet heroism. The plane began its gradual descent as it approached the outskirts of New York City. Outside the window, the clouds thinned, revealing the sprawling urban landscape below. The sunlight reflected off the buildings and river surfaces, casting long shadows across the city. Inside the cabin, passengers began to stir, adjusting their seats, fastening their seatbelts, and gathering belongings. The routine sounds of flight preparation for landing filled the air. The clatter of overhead bins, the gentle hum of engines slowing, and the soft footsteps of flight attendants moving efficiently through the aisles. James Porter remained seated in seat 12F, hands resting lightly on his briefcase, his calm demeanor undisturbed. From the outside, he looked like an ordinary traveler preparing for a routine landing. Inside, however, his mind was alert, processing every detail of the cabin, the flight, and the people around him. He had spent years training for moments like this, times when ordinary environments suddenly required extraordinary awareness. His life had been defined by vigilance, by attention to the smallest of details, and by calm action under pressure. The subtle tension in the cabin was palpable. The pilot had not made any further announcements regarding James, yet the earlier recognition had left a lingering effect on both passengers and crew. People spoke in hushed tones, casting occasional glances toward seat 12F. Some tried to focus on their electronic devices or books, but their curiosity persisted. They could not help but notice the calm authority that seemed to radiate from James, an aura that demanded quiet attention without a single word. The flight attendants moved methodically through the cabin, checking that seatbelts were fastened, trays were secured, and carry-on items were properly stowed. James observed them with the same calm attention he had maintained throughout the flight, noting subtle gestures, small movements, and the efficiency of their routines. Every person on the plane played a role in maintaining safety and order, and James appreciated that discipline. Passengers began adjusting their own positions, preparing for the final descent. Children fidgeted slightly, some clutching small toys or electronic devices, while adults checked phones, organized paperwork, or simply stared out the windows at the city below. James, observing them quietly, understood the natural mix of excitement, anxiety, and anticipation that often accompanied landings. Humans, he reflected, were fascinating in the way they responded to routine events with unique emotional patterns. As the plane descended, the engines adjusted their power, producing a low, steady hum. Turbulence occasionally shook the cabin, gentle but noticeable. Some passengers instinctively gripped their armrests, while others adjusted their seating positions. James remained unshaken, his posture calm, his hands resting lightly on the briefcase. To him, turbulence was a minor factor, a normal part of flight. Yet he noted every subtle reaction, understanding that these small details revealed much about human behavior under mild stress. A young woman a few rows ahead whispered to her companion, her voice barely audible. "He's still so calm. How is he not reacting at all?" Her companion, clearly equally intrigued, shrugged. "Maybe he's used to this kind of thing. I don't know, it's like he's in a different world." Their curiosity was natural. James had learned to accept it, to allow observers their speculation while maintaining his own focus. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, clear and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach into New York. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, seats upright, and tray tables stowed. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The calm, steady voice reassured the passengers, though some still glanced toward James, wondering what exactly had transpired earlier in the flight. James allowed himself a brief mental review of the flight so far. He considered the recognition by the pilot, the reactions of the passengers, and the subtle behaviors of the crew. Each detail, each observation was stored and analyzed. He understood that ordinary appearances could mask extraordinary circumstances, and even routine flights could provide insights into human behavior and operational dynamics. His life had been defined by such lessons, and he carried them forward quietly, without drawing attention. As the plane continued its descent, the city grew larger outside the windows. Streets, highways, and bridges became more distinct. The river reflected the morning sunlight, creating a shimmering path through the urban landscape. James observed the layout with a professional interest, noting the density of traffic, patterns of movement, and potential landmarks. While other passengers admired the view, James' observation was systematic, analytical, and precise. Flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, checking that passengers were following the landing procedures. James noticed their subtle gestures, the small signs of professionalism and awareness that ensured safety. Each movement, though ordinary to the casual observer, carried significance in the larger context of operations. James absorbed these details silently, appreciating the coordinated effort required to maintain safety and order. The plane passed through a thin layer of clouds, the city below becoming clearer with every moment. The hum of engines changed subtly as the pilots adjusted for descent. Passengers adjusted as well, some leaning forward slightly, others pressing the backs of their seats upright. James remained composed, hands lightly on his briefcase, eyes occasionally glancing toward the cabin and observing patterns of movement and behavior. Suddenly, a minor vibration ran through the floor as the plane passed through a small pocket of turbulence. Passengers instinctively gripped armrests or leaned slightly, a few letting out quiet breaths of concern. James did not move. His calm presence provided a silent anchor in the cabin, a subtle reassurance to those around him, even if they could not consciously recognize it. A man seated across the aisle, clearly trying to distract himself from nervousness, whispered to his companion, "I don't know why, but he makes me feel calmer. Look at him, completely steady." His companion nodded, glancing at James. Indeed, there was something extraordinary about the way he maintained composure. It was as if his presence alone provided a subtle sense of stability in an environment where many felt tension. James allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about how ordinary individuals often underestimated the power of calm observation, of quiet authority, and of vigilance. His life had taught him that ordinary appearances often concealed the extraordinary, and that maintaining composure under pressure was not just a skill, but a responsibility. Every action, every gesture, every moment of observation could influence outcomes in ways unseen by others. As the plane continued its descent, the cityscape became more detailed. Streets, parks, and buildings formed a complex grid below. Vehicles moved along roads, tiny in scale but part of a larger pattern. James' mind processed the scene, noting landmarks, potential routes, and patterns of human activity. To him, even the ordinary view outside the window provided valuable insights, lessons in observation, and understanding of human behavior on a macro scale. The flight attendants moved down the aisles one last time, checking seatbelts and trays, offering quiet reassurances to passengers. James noted their efficiency, professionalism, and subtle coordination. Each gesture, each movement, contributed to the overall safety and order of the cabin. He appreciated these details, recognizing that even minor actions could have significant impact in the event of unexpected circumstances. Passengers adjusted for landing, some straightening clothing, others ensuring personal belongings were secure. Children were gently reminded to stay seated. Adults checked phones or quietly conversed. James observed all of this, noting patterns, behaviors, and subtle dynamics. While ordinary to most, these details were part of the broader picture he maintained internally, an ongoing assessment of environment, behavior, and potential variables. The plane approached the final stretch of descent, engines adjusting power smoothly. The runway became visible below, stretching out amidst the surrounding landscape. James' focus remained sharp, observing subtle shifts in the cabin, the actions of crew members, and the responses of passengers. Calm composure was key in moments like these, and he maintained it perfectly. A faint smile crossed his face as he reflected on the flight. What had begun as a routine journey had subtly transformed into an extraordinary experience, not because of danger, but because of recognition, observation, and human curiosity. The pilot's acknowledgement of James had set the tone, shifting the energy of the cabin and creating an environment rich in subtle tension, curiosity, and fascination. Passengers, still curious but reassured by the professionalism of the crew and the calm demeanor of James, settled into their seats. The gentle hum of the engines, the rhythmic adjustments of the plane, and the steady presence of those around them created a sense of order. James observed quietly, noting patterns, behaviors, and subtle details with a practiced eye. The final approach continued, the plane descending steadily toward the runway. Passengers adjusted, some pressing seats upright, others gripping armrests lightly. Flight attendants moved efficiently, maintaining calm and order. Outside, the city grew more defined, roads, buildings, and parks forming a clear map beneath the plane. James noted these details, appreciating the complexity and patterns of human activity, even from high above. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, tires squealing softly against the asphalt, the cabin exhaled collectively. Some passengers clapped lightly, others smiled at the smooth landing. James remained composed, a quiet observer of both human reactions and the environment. The flight had been ordinary in appearance, yet extraordinary in subtlety, observation, and recognition. The engine slowed, brakes engaged, and the plane taxied toward the terminal. Passengers prepared to disembark, gathering belongings and adjusting clothing. James, still calm, retrieved his briefcase and prepared to exit. The curiosity of others lingered subtly, a quiet acknowledgement of the presence and influence of Seat 12F. As the plane reached the gate and doors opened, passengers began to leave. Some glanced toward James one last time, intrigued by the man who had maintained composure throughout the flight. Crew members nodded subtly in his direction, acknowledging the calm and confidence he had displayed. James stepped onto the jet bridge, moving with quiet purpose, ready to continue his journey beyond the plane. Even as the airport buzzed around him, with travelers rushing past and announcements filling the air, James remained composed, focused, and observant. His life had always required attention, discretion, and calm under pressure. Today, on this flight, he had demonstrated those qualities effortlessly. Seat 12F had been ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in presence, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most remarkable stories unfold in the midst of everyday life.